Hey you guys, it's Quiet, and today I'm going to be talking about every album, mixtape, project, release I listened to in the month of May. This is a new compilation series I thought to do. I hope you guys like it. I listened to a lot of music this month, like 30 different projects or so, maybe a bit more, I don't know. I divided all these projects into three separate categories: releases I've never heard, releases I've heard and I'm unfamiliar with, and releases I've heard and I'm familiar with. Let's get into it. Portishead Dummy. This is a familiar re-listen. This album definitely sounds better from when I first heard it. This was my first trip hop album, and it wasn't what I was expecting from a genre that fuses hip hop and electronic music. I was expecting somewhat high energy rapping with cool techno production, but that's not really what I got. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think trip hop. What I really got from this album was laid back production with some beautiful singing. It's a decent album to me now. I appreciate it more. Travis Scott's Rodeo, an unfamiliar re-listen. I mentioned this in my Utopia video. I used to hate Travis Scott's music so much. Now I think it's some of the most top tier experimental left field trap music of all time. This re-listen of Rodeo was like listening to it for the first time because I haven't listened to the album in years, and nothing about the album sounded familiar except for like 2 or 3 songs. Travis to me is like the most mainstream experimental artist, and this album proves it. Lucky's Alternative Trap, first to listen. Or should I say Lucky X Alternative Trap, first to listen. I'm a hardcore Lucky fan, but I've never really listened to his earlier catalog until now. His debut is extremely impressive for a debut. I couldn't believe how good of a release this was. Lucky was getting compared to artists like Earl Sweatshirt this early in his career. Once again, impressive. I really love how lyrical and conscious of a rapper he was before he changed his sound. He gets pretty deep on this one. Also can't forget how amazing and esoteric the production is on this album. Every track kicks ass. I can't wait to listen to his other early releases. Wi-Fi God's Chain of Command, first to listen. The more I listen to Wi-Fi God's discography, the more impressed I get. I'm gonna take this jacket off. Wi-Fi God has an impressive amount of releases he has released. I probably won't hear it all. I really like his production style and his simple and typical trap lyrics. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, first listen. I remember someone calling this album a snooze fest on a needle drop Let's Argue video. That's not true like at all. I'm really glad that opinion did not influence my opinion on this pretty awesome album. It's such a relaxing album, and it's great background music. It's also great if you want to give your undivided attention to it. I can imagine myself in a jazz lounge smoking hookah to this project. I don't smoke that, but that's what comes to mind when I listen to this album. 100 gecs, 10,000 gecs. Familiar re-listen. This was another re-listen I felt like mention, just for the sake of completion and having everything I listened to in this video. If you've seen my previous videos, you know why I love this album. It's amazing. Lucky's Sex Money Drugs, familiar re-listen. This album still sounds good, but it's his second weakest project. Whatever, on to the next album. Spelling's The Turning Wheel, familiar re-listen. I think it's safe to say my taste in music has become more refined, because when I first heard this album, it didn't blow me away like it blew away every other music nerd. I just thought it was meh, except for the title track. And I was a big fan of her sophomore album, Maisie Fly. This re-listen really made me appreciate this album. That's the trend in this video. Albums I didn't really like at first but grew on me. The Weeknd's Beauty Behind the Madness, first listen. I used to hate on The Weeknd just because he was popular, and I never gave his music an unbiased listen. Boy, have times changed. This is a good album. I like it more than the other Weeknd albums I have listened to, the only other one being House of Balloons. He's got a really beautiful voice, and he has an ear for really good production quality. Biohazard's Urban Discipline, first listen. Biohazard is such a killer rap metal band. I feel like they're pioneers of this style of music. Funny enough, this record was released the same year as Rage Against the Machine's first album, but the Rage album gets all the love. I love how you can't really tell if they're trying to make metal music or hardcore music. At times, they're really good at fusing genres. Elliott Smith's self-titled Unfamiliar Re-Listen. This is another one that sounded like a completely different album the moment I re-listened to it. Either or made me realize how good of an artist Elliott Smith really was, and it made me familiar with his sound so much that it completely changed my opinion on his self-titled album. This one kicks ass. Toro y Moi's Boo Boo, Unfamiliar Re-Listen. A sudden change in scenery, kind of. I'm wearing a different shirt. That's because I'm recording this at a completely different time. But anyways, what I wanted to do, one day I was going home, coming from work, high as a kite, listening to Boo Boo by Toro y Moi. And it sounded like the greatest thing ever to me, and I never listened to the album again until now. This was back in 2019. All I can say is it doesn't sound as good when I first heard it, but it's still pretty decent, and marijuana has a way of completely changing your opinion on certain kinds of music. Some of the most mediocre stuff sounds amazing on weed. Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come, first listen. This album rubbed me the wrong way on my first listen. It's one of those records I respect more than I actually like. This project was made in the 50s, which is impressive. There's not too many albums from the 50s that I have heard, and it certainly sounds like it influenced the sound of jazz music in the years that came after it. If I had to give an oversimplified opinion on the record, it's just alright. Nocturnus's The Key, Unfamiliar Re-Listen. I don't know how long it's been since I've listened to this album, but I wasn't super familiar with this album when I re-listened to it in May. Once again, it's an unfamiliar re-listen, which I'm happy about because this is one of those albums that loses its luster the more you listen to it. Familiarity breeds contempt. I really like this one. It reminded me of my metal phase in high school, and I didn't know this album is considered to be the first progressive death metal album. It certainly sounds innovative, and I absolutely love the piano synths they used on this record. Shawnee Bin Laden's Wick the Wizard, first listen. I only heard this one once, and it sucks cause it's a cool trap record. For some reason, it's not on Spotify anymore. Ironically, I found the album because of Spotify, because they kept recommending me the song that samples Opus 3. I'm a fan of Shawnee Bin Laden's gangster rap lyrics, and his beat selection is pretty good too. Is it Marina or Marina? Marina's Electra Heart, first listen. There's some songs on this one that sound like painfully dated 2010s radio pop, and I like that. It feels like a time capsule. Marina has changed a lot since this record. Ancient Dreams in a Modern Land has a completely different vibe compared to this one. I gotta check out her other records. Right now she's 2 for 2. American Football's self-titled Unfamiliar Re-Listen. This was another grower that sounded like a completely different album on this re-listen. I was completely turned off by American Football when I first heard this record. The only song I liked was Never Meant. I love that song, but now almost every song on this album is a really cute piece of chilled out Midwestern emo to me. Gotta love those saxophone sections too. It's a decent record, and I gotta hear the newer stuff sometime in the near future. Lustig Puppy's Carousel from Hell, familiar re-listen. Shit slaps. Frank Zappa's Hot Rats, familiar re-listen. Frank Zappa is goated. He has the coolest mustache, and this record is a really great piece of jazz fusion. Not as good as the Intermounting Flame, but good. Good means good. Shout out to Captain Beefheart for being a weird feature on this one. And I'd also like to say thank you to Fantano for introducing me to this album. System of a Down's self-titled, first listen. This record is just okay. The best songs are just decent, and there's a lot of filler on this record. I hope one day this record grows on me, but this is not one of my favorite System of a Down records as of today. Slowdive's Slovaki. Familiar re-listen. This album slightly diminished in quality for me. It's been a while since I heard this one, but this album I remember liking more when I first heard it. When I first heard it, shoegaze was a completely new genre to me. So I guess now that I'm more familiar with that genre, this album became 6 out of 10ish to me. Honestly, I like My Bloody Valentine's take on shoegaze more than Slowdive's. Machine Gun and When the Sun Hits will always be the greatest melancholy but glee at the same time songs ever to me. Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited. First listen. Bob Dylan has officially joined a very small list of my favorite country artists. This album isn't just country, but you get what I'm saying. This record, especially the opener, gives me such joy. And Bob Dylan's lyrics really are as good as everyone says they are. Elliott Smith's Either Or. First to listen. This is the record that made me into an Elliott Smith believer. It's so good I listened to Ballad of Big Nothing for the first time through Spotify Radio, and that's the song that made me understand Elliott Smith. Let me tell you, there wouldn't be an Alex G without Elliott Smith. His death was really an awful tragedy. Mac Miller's Circles. First listen. Mac is a great rapper, but also a great singer and lyricist. This is one of the few posthumous records I actually care about. It's pretty well done, and I think Mac would like this record if he was still alive. There's some cool electronic sounding beats on this record, but then there's also like really acoustic singer-songwriter style production on this album, and those two sounds work surprisingly well together. Always' self-title. First listen. This album has one amazing 10 out of 10 song on it, that song being Archie Marry Me. But that's the high point of the album, and we never see that high point again. In a way, that song ruins the album because the rest of the album never lives up to that song. It's pretty disappointing. Everything else is just decent. Duran Duran's Rio. First listen. This record is so 80s, I got inspired and created an 80s playlist on Spotify. To me, this is peak 80s synth pop, but that's not saying much because I don't listen to much 80s synth pop. The Cure's Three Imaginary Boys. Unfamiliar re-listen. I think I was still in high school when I first heard this one. This re-listen made me question my opinion on The Cure. They're cool, but most of their discography isn't that impressive to me. They're just an okay goth band with great hits, but like only one great album. Their debut is such a mixed bag, it's annoying. There's great songs on this album, but I almost don't care because of how spotty the track placement is, and because of how lame the lame songs are. Nirvana's Bleach. Unfamiliar re-listen. I used to hate Nirvana's music, except for this album. Now I love Nirvana's music, and I still love this album. I love the sheer rawness and punk energy of this release. It's crazy how this band would go on to make Nevermind. Justice self-title. There's a lot of self-titles. First listen. This is the best record I heard this month, okay? And the most obvious 10 out of 10 if you want to give it a rating. I think it's a 10. I need to give it more listens before I give it that rating. But still, this is a 10 out of 10 album. Everything about this record is top notch. It has some crazy danceable songs, then it has some aggressive sounding but still danceable songs. It's everything I look for in a house record. The vocals, when there are vocals, are infectious, and it doesn't feel like a cheap imitation of Daft Punk. I can hear the Discovery influence on this record, but still, it's not a cheap imitation. Which is impressive because they're both French house. Knocked Loose's You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To. First listen. I did a little review on this one. All I'm going to say is, it's brutal AF. Beabadoobie's Fake It Flowers. First listen. I finally know how to pronounce Beabadoobie's name. She has a beautiful voice and she makes very typical indie pop slash indie rock. But it certainly sounds good. Simple isn't bad. I've said it before. I wasn't really feeling her first singles when I first listened to them, but my opinions have grown and changed. Eminem, the Marshall Mathers LP. First listen. I used to think Eminem was the most overrated rapper of all time. Now I don't know about that because I haven't listened to enough of his music. What I used to think about his music is just an assumption. This record is pretty decent. I like it way more than the Slim Shady LP, which I kinda hate. Eminem is a lyrical genius that cannot be denied. His storytelling on Stan is god tier, and his witty wordplay on the real Slim Shady is unmatched. Denzel Curry's 32 Zell, Planet Shrooms, Unfamiliar re-listen. This is the most criminally underrated Denzel project to this day. It's crazy how Ultimate is on this album, but no one talks about this double EP. It's so fire, the beats sound like they're from another planet. If you're a Denzel fan and you haven't bumped this yet, you're doing yourself a disservice. Atari Teenage Riot, The Future of War, first to listen. This record is punk AF. It's so raw and abrasive. Atari Teenage Riot does not give AF. They need to put this record on Spotify as soon as possible. I need better accessibility to this album. I can't remember a bad song on this record. Green Day's Insomniac. Unfamiliar re-listen. This album is better than Dookie, okay? I don't care what anyone else says. This was my favorite Green Day record in high school, and it still probably is. There were a few songs I don't remember at all because it's been such a while, but my favorites I remembered. This record needs a bit more love, I feel. Vision of Disorder's self-title, Unfamiliar re-listen. This is a decent New York hardcore record. They have a very shouty vocalist, which is annoying at times. I wish he would change the volume and sound of his voice at times. It feels like he's doing the same thing over and over again. Besides that, the guitar melodies are solid and they're never boring to listen to. And that's the video. This has been in no particular order if you were wondering. I hope you enjoyed. It's been Quite This Music. Out. Like, comment, and subscribe.